Hunting the Shadow Fleet. Washington globalizes the Iran pressure campaign. Trump, Israel, Lebanon agree to 10-day ceasefire following US brokered talks. HEGSETH, US locked and loaded to strike Iran's power infrastructure if no deal is reached. Iran rising executions under an information blackout.
A no-shots-fired blockade is tightening around Iran. Each passing day burns through hundreds of millions of dollars. Every vessel is a potential target, and a single miscalculation could push the Middle East into an uncontrollable confrontation. After 21 hours of failed negotiations, the United States expanded its sanctions on Iran across every corner of the globe. A stark signal has emerged from Washington. The United States is no longer merely increasing pressure. It is scaling the campaign globally to choke off Iran's operational lifelines, from maritime routes to international financial networks. According to Fox News reporting on America's Newsroom, thousands of US personnel have been deployed in support of a large-scale interdiction effort aimed at tightening control over all transport activity linked to Tehran. This is no longer sanctions in the traditional sense. It is a de facto global containment architecture, a tightening steel ring. Any vessel tied to Iran, whether inbound or outbound, can be stopped, inspected, and, if necessary, compelled to comply with US directives. Early indicators point to an immediate operational effect. At least 13 vessels reversed course as soon as the blockade was activated. No shots fired, no direct contact. Yet the signal alone was sufficient to force compliance. This underscores a key reality. Washington is not relying solely on kinetic power, but on a high-end deterrence model, where the credible risk of interdiction, inspection, or seizure drives actors to comply before any confrontation occurs. Behind this no-shots-fired posture, however, is a hard enforcement framework. US military commanders have outlined a clear escalation ladder for non-compliant vessels: shadowing and approach, signaling and warnings, warning shots, and, if required, boarding and seizure. What elevates the tension further is the expanded geographic scope. The operation is no longer confined to the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz. US authorities have declared a global hunt for the so-called Shadow Fleet, vessels operating with opaque registration, routinely disabling tracking systems, and suspected of moving unknown and sanctioned goods for Iran. According to defense officials, these ships can be tracked and interdicted across a wide arc, from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, from a regional containment effort to a global interdiction campaign, compressing Iran's operational space to its narrowest margins. In parallel with military pressure, Washington is executing a calibrated economic strike, choking off oil revenue, Tehran's primary lifeline. US officials estimate the blockade is costing Iran hundreds of millions of dollars per day in lost income. Against the backdrop of an economy already strained by prolonged sanctions, the pressure presents Tehran with a narrowing set of options: continue escalation and absorb mounting losses, or return to negotiations on US terms, curbing uranium enrichment, abandoning nuclear weapons ambitions, and limiting long-range missile development. Beyond economics, the campaign carries a significant geopolitical dimension. The United States has secured backing from key regional partners, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Jordan. Military commanders point to an emerging coalition framework, integrating some of the region's most capable air forces, positioned to act if tensions escalate. If conflict breaks out, it will not remain a bilateral US-Iran issue. It could rapidly expand into a multinational confrontation at scale. At the same time, diplomatic channels remain open, but highly uncertain. The White House indicates that renewed talks are under consideration, potentially with Pakistan as an intermediary. The gap, however, remains wide. Tehran insists on recognition of its rights and interests, while Washington holds firm on nuclear and military constraints, creating a standoff where military and economic pressure serve as leverage at the negotiating table. The picture is further complicated by the role of major powers such as China and Russia. While Washington states that Beijing is not directly supplying weapons, intelligence assessments leave open the possibility of indirect support, such as satellite data, echoing patterns of great power competition reminiscent of the Cold War. In that context, the blockade is no longer just a US-Iran confrontation, but part of a broader global power contest. Taken together, this is a multi-domain strategy, integrating military, economic, and diplomatic pressure to maximum effect. While no immediate escalation is evident, the region is operating at elevated risk. A single miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction. The central question is no longer whether tensions will rise, but which side will yield first, and at what cost. As pressure on Iran continues to expand, parallel diplomatic movement is emerging across the region, most notably in Lebanon, where Washington is attempting to de-escalate a secondary front. Israel-Lebanon agree to 10-day ceasefire following US-brokered talks. A temporary ceasefire is set to take effect late Thursday following rare US-mediated negotiations in Washington. US President Donald Trump announced that Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire window. In a post on Truth Social dated April 16th, Trump said he held very productive calls with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. According to the statement, both sides committed to formally begin the ceasefire at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on April 16th. The agreement follows a rare round of direct talks in Washington, facilitated by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I directed Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary Rubio, along with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Kane, to engage Israel and Lebanon toward a sustainable peace, Trump stated. It is my honor to have resolved 9 conflicts worldwide. This will be my 10th. Let's get it done. President Donald Trump said the ceasefire initiative is intended to create breathing space as Washington pursues parallel diplomatic efforts on the Iran file. In a Truth Social post on April 16th, Trump noted that direct engagement between the two sides had been absent for decades. It's been a very long time, roughly 34 years since the two leaders spoke. That changes tomorrow. That's a good thing, he wrote. In a post on X, the Lebanese presidency said Trump and Aoun spoke by phone later that day, with Aoun thanking Trump for efforts to secure a ceasefire in Lebanon and to achieve lasting peace and stability. Separately, the US Embassy in Beirut said on X that Ambassador Michel Issa met with President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio on April 15th. The Post said they reaffirmed their commitment to ongoing talks and to the embassy's efforts in Beirut to support the restoration of Lebanon's sovereignty and its monopoly on the use of force. The talks are unfolding as Israel continues to conduct military operations beyond the Iran theater. On April 7th, President Donald Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire in the 6-week conflict with Iran. On April 8th, the Israel Defense Forces executed its largest coordinated airstrike in Lebanon to date, targeting more than 100 command nodes and military facilities linked to Hezbollah, a US-designated terrorist organization, across Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and southern Lebanon. By April 16th, escalation continued. An Israeli strike destroyed the last remaining bridge connecting southern Lebanon to the rest of the country, according to a senior Lebanese security official speaking to Reuters, who said the structure was completely destroyed and beyond repair. Iranian state media, INRA, reported the same day that Tehran views a Lebanon ceasefire as strategically critical. In a call with Lebanese Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri, Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf stated that a ceasefire in Lebanon is as important to Iran as a ceasefire in Iran itself. Senior Israeli officials told the Epoch Times that the arrangement would mirror the November 2024 ceasefire framework with Hezbollah. Under that model, Israeli forces would retain positions currently held inside Lebanon with no withdrawal, while preserving full freedom of action for self-defense and preemptive strikes against emerging threats. According to a 2024 US congressional report, Hezbollah is designated by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization backed by Iran and operating primarily in Lebanon. The report characterizes Hezbollah as a key proxy for Tehran, enabling Iran to project influence across the region, train aligned militia networks, reportedly including elements linked to Hamas, and threaten US interests and partner forces. It also notes that Hezbollah has leveraged Israel's presence in disputed areas such as the Sheba farms and along the Lebanon-Syria-Israel tri-border zone to justify sustained hostile actions against Israel. Behind the diplomatic track, Washington is maintaining a clear fallback: military escalation if required. US locked and loaded to strike Iran's power infrastructure if no deal is reached. US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth on April 16th urged Iran to reach an agreement with Washington, warning that military operations could be rapidly reactivated, with power generation infrastructure among the primary targets. The preference is to resolve this the easy way, through a deal led by our Vice President and negotiating team. Or we can do it the hard way, Hegseth said, speaking at the Pentagon alongside Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane. He emphasized that the US objective remains unchanged: to ensure Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon, a core rationale cited by officials in the Trump administration for the strikes conducted in late February. Tehran has consistently denied pursuing nuclear weapons. Maintaining its program is for civilian purposes. Hegseth called on Iranian leadership to choose wisely, framing the decision as both strategic and humanitarian. A deal is within reach, one that serves your people and global stability, he said. At the same time, US forces have sustained a naval blockade of Iranian ports since April 13th, intensifying economic pressure on the regime. We are reloaded, at higher capacity and with better intelligence than ever before, Hegseth added. We are fully prepared to strike key dual-use infrastructure, the remainder of your power grid, and your energy sector. We do not want to do that. The US Treasury on April 15th imposed a new round of sanctions targeting Iranian assets, including a maritime oil transport network, in a bid to increase leverage over Iran at the negotiating table. US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth underscored that current enforcement reflects only a fraction of available force. The blockade, covering Iranian ports across the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, is being executed with limited assets relative to total US naval capacity. The math is straightforward. We're operating with roughly 10% of the world's most capable navy. You're at zero, Hegseth said. According to defense officials, the United States Navy currently maintains 16 warships in the Middle East, including 11 destroyers, 3 amphibious assault ships, 1 aircraft carrier, and 1 littoral combat ship, out of a fleet of roughly 300 vessels. Hegseth also assessed that Iran's ability to regenerate combat power at scale remains limited following the 5-week conflict. While Tehran can reposition forces, it cannot reconstitute lost capabilities at scale. A ceasefire between the United States and Iran was announced last week by President Donald Trump after weeks of fighting, leading to talks in Pakistan over the weekend, talks that ended without agreement. Following US and Israeli strikes, Iran retaliated with missile and explosive drone attacks against Israel and other regional targets, while also targeting commercial shipping. The Strait of Hormuz, a critical global transit route, was effectively shut down during the conflict, driving sharp increases in oil and gas prices and raising broader concerns over global economic stability. Brigadier General Ali Abdollahi, commander of Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, warned in a statement carried by the semi-official Tasnim news agency. If the United States continues what we view as aggressive and unlawful actions, imposing a maritime blockade in the region and destabilizing Iranian commercial shipping and oil tankers, such behavior will constitute grounds for violating the ceasefire.
Under those conditions, Iran's armed forces will not permit any import or export activity to proceed across the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, or the Red Sea.
However, viewing the Iran crisis solely through a military and diplomatic lens leaves the picture incomplete. Parallel to external pressure is a deepening internal human rights crisis. Rising executions under an information blackout. While global media attention remains fixed on the US-Iran military chessboard, the world appears to be overlooking the initial spark that ignited the entire conflict. Iran operates as a highly centralized authoritarian system, where a dense internal security apparatus is structured to enforce absolute compliance. Power is not oriented toward public service, but toward regime preservation, sustained through pervasive surveillance and systemic violence. Any form of dissent is treated as an existential threat and is suppressed accordingly, either through direct military force or deterrent executions. The weaponization of law and the isolation of information are not merely tools of control. They point to a system that prioritizes regime survival over fundamental freedoms in order to preserve its grip on power. During the protest waves of 2025 to 2026, multiple human rights reports indicate that security forces employed live ammunition, carried out mass arrests, and conducted expedited judicial proceedings. Casualty figures remain highly contested. Official numbers report only several thousand deaths, while independent sources and hospital-based data suggest the toll could reach into the tens of thousands, with some estimates approaching or exceeding the 20,000 mark. At this stage, the crisis in Iran is no longer confined to geopolitical or military dimensions. It is increasingly manifesting as a severe humanitarian emergency. Amid widespread internet restrictions, human rights organizations report a new wave of death sentences issued against individuals linked to the January protests, including women, signaling that the level of repression is entering a more escalatory and lethal phase. Available data points to at least 656 executions over a 3-month period, with more than half occurring in January alone. This is no longer episodic. It reflects a systematic approach to social control through deterrence. The reported inclusion of a woman on execution lists for the first time in this wave carries symbolic weight, suggesting that previous thresholds in handling dissent may have been removed. Allegations regarding the treatment of women prior to execution have further fueled international concern. While such claims require independent verification, their circulation underscores the depth of alarm surrounding current human rights conditions. More broadly, Iran's crisis cannot be reduced to a state-to-state confrontation or an Neft-driven calculus. At its core lies the lived reality of tens of millions under a system of control spanning nearly half a century, where personal freedoms remain tightly constrained, well beyond the pressures of sanctions or the risks of war. Accounts from individuals who left Iran at a young age point to a different reality. The country has not always looked like this. Prior to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iran experienced periods of relative openness with strong Western influence. The regime change fundamentally reshaped society, particularly for women, forcing many families to leave under high-risk conditions in search of a different future for their children. At the same time, information control has tightened significantly. As tensions escalated, internet access was restricted for weeks, leaving the outside world effectively blind. Yet limited leaks reveal a striking paradox. Segments of the population appear to fear their own government more than external threats. This marks a critical shift in how the crisis is understood. When the primary source of fear is no longer war, but the governing system itself, the nature of the conflict changes, from state versus state confrontation to state versus society dynamics. Why have large-scale protests not re-emerged? The answer lies in a control architecture built on deterrence through fear. Public executions, severe sentencing, and a pervasive security presence have created an environment where dissent carries extreme personal risk. When the cost can be one's life, silence is not consent.
It is coercion.
At the international level, the Iran issue is also deeply politicized, particularly within the United States. One camp supports hardline measures, including military pressure to force change. Another questions their effectiveness and warns of escalation risks that could further destabilize the situation. Notably, this debate extends beyond policy into core values, human rights, and gender equality. Criticism directed at Western public figures reflects growing frustration. When those who claim to champion women's rights remain muted on Iran, the consistency of their positions is increasingly questioned. Ultimately, the crisis in Iran sits at the intersection of politics, economics, military dynamics, and human rights, but its core is human. Execution figures, accounts of repression, and a pervasive climate of fear point to more than a state-to-state confrontation. They indicate a large-scale human rights crisis. In that context, any solution, diplomatic or military, that fails to place people at the center is unlikely to produce durable outcomes. Until that changes, Iran will remain one of the world's most complex flashpoints, where the line between geopolitics and humanitarian concern continues to blur. Is Washington stabilizing the situation or setting conditions for a broader escalation cycle? Share your assessment in the comments.